All right, Twitterless Steve Schirmer is here, co-host of the Hold the Green podcast on the Inside Sports Podcast Network. Steve, welcome. How we doing, buddy? Feeling a little bit better?
Yeah, I'm feeling a lot better. It was good that you had Shaq on the show last week with his big, deep voice and big golf takes. But yes, I'm feeling slightly better, but on a steroid for about a week now. So I was saying before the show, we agreed on a lot of stuff, felt like last podcast. So maybe the steroid is enough to kind of mix things up and get us to be a little more contentious. So we'll see how that plays out tonight.
As much as I love agreeing with you because I trust and value your opinion, I'm never opposed to that from a podcasting standpoint. Although I told you before we went on air, my opinions on Royal Portrush in particular are fairly undefined. I mean, I always have strong opinions. That's why I'm a podcaster, but they're very loosely held as it pertains to Portrush. So I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about that golf course. Oakmont, I feel a lot better about. Even without strokes gain data from the 2016 US Open and not having played the golf course before, I feel like I have a very solid handle on Oakmont. And I spent a lot of time watching back the final round of the 2016 US Open, which is incredible entertainment, by the way. And I would highly recommend not just watching the official film, but if you are like me and you have the terrible habit of falling asleep to screens, I love falling asleep to like 7 hour final rounds of majors. It takes me like 5 nights to get through. But there's a lot of good stuff in there. So anyway, I figure we kick it right off the bat with Oakmont. I guess the question I would ask you, Steve, is this the best US Open venue?
Oh, the best U.S. Open venue?
Correct.
I think in terms of maybe golf course quality, it
Mm-hmm.
is. In terms of
This is,
venue,
yeah, this is the fifth ranked golf course in America and the eighth ranked golf course in the world.
sure. Like as far as design and how the course is laid out and the challenges that it presents, I would probably say it's definitely close to the top. I think for pure entertainment standpoint, though, I mean, nothing really beats Shinnecock over the weekend when that gets really spicy and firm and windswept. It probably also doesn't help either that the 2016 U.S. Open, while we did have the on-course drama, which is what happened with Dustin Johnson and the ball movie, which we can talk about that coverage and how that all played out, but it kind of got to be a little bit of a runaway towards the back nine there. DJ, even with the looming penalty, really put it away. Lowry, if you watch back that coverage, just completely choked it away
It
there.
was
It was
kind of cool
awful.
watching 2019 Open Championship and 2016 US Open in succession because it was a true comeback story for Lowry. I mean, the guy is 4 strokes back at 4 strokes ahead at Oakmont heading into the final round and completely throws up all over himself, and DJ ends up winning. And then he takes a 3 shot lead into the Portrush final round and puts on a pretty remarkable closing performance, ends up winning Portrush by 6. So we got the full Monty with Shane Lowry over the past weekend.
Yeah, that was exactly my thought too. It was because I did the same thing as you. I watched the entire 7 hours or so across like 2 nights for Oakmont. And then I remember the 2016 US Open pretty well, but it was interesting to go back and see just how exactly, like, I guess I forgot that I knew Lowry had a lead. I didn't realize maybe I forgot it was that big. And I remember
Mm-hmm.
they had to come back in the morning and finish because they got rain early in the tournament, softened up the golf course. It pushed everything basically back. But I guess I forgot how big of a choke job Lowry really had. Honestly, like even the front nine, like I wasn't all that impressed by DJ. He was making some silly mistakes. He was missing
Mm-hmm.
some putts. Just the back nine, though, he absolutely put the hammer down, and it helped that Lowry put away. But yeah, right. It was very cool to see the redemption story after that 3 years later, where Lowry has a similar big lead. And I remember actually making this point in both my pre-tournament column, and I wasn't doing the podcast yet, but we had our Discord at that point, And I said, Lowry's not going to hold on to this. I've already seen this movie before. Tommy Fleetwood's going to get this, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But so it was nice to see, even though it really wasn't, in linear fashion, it was nice to see the redemption story for him. But, as far as Oakmont, though, I mean, as like I just mentioned, as far as golf course quality, probably the best. We'll get to how it played, even without the strokes gained. There were some things I noticed going back from the telecast. The one thing, though, that is missing, and we can talk about a little bit, is how, because I love going to Google Earth and I
Mhm.
love seeing, especially with golf course changes, what change. And I know they did big bunker renovations there.
Gil Hanse
Yep,
came
Gil
in
Hanse did there.
2023.
Yep,
Yeah.
they expanded the greens. They didn't rebuild the greens. They made an effort to say that, but they expanded the greens. Kind of like with Winged Foot, they kind of expanded out, but the greens itself are still not rebuilt like other places are.
Yeah. Oak Hill
So,
as well.
yep,
Yeah, we saw that. Okay.
right. So there is still, I think, a little bit of a mystery as far as will the golf course where they've changed it change how it plays? But just based on some of the high surface level stuff they've done, they've lengthened it, I think, about 160 yards, which, if you just account for the gains in distance for over the last 9 years, it's about, just accounting for that, I think it pushes on average about like 8 or 9 yards a hole. Kind of like what
Hmm.
they did with the Open Championship with all those venues. They just push back tee boxes to account for the gains in distance. So, it probably, as long as there's nothing anything too crazy else they did with the golf course, probably will play pretty similar tee to green, just that everybody's a little longer now, a little farther back. So I think there still is some value watching that 2016 U.S. Open, seeing how it played, um, and getting some good notes on it for this year.
Yeah, I think that my case for Oakmont as the best US Open venue is I want to say that there are six golf courses in the top 20 in America consensus that have hosted a US Open in the last 20 years. Oakmont, Marion, Pinehurst, Pebble Beach, Los Angeles Country Club, and Shinnecock. And four out of those six golf courses, all of those golf courses in their own right are architectural masterpieces outside of Pebble Beach, in my opinion. Pebble Beach just has the best views in America, and there's some really good architectural stuff to that golf course too. Um, but four out of the six golf courses, and this is a really hard thing to do. This is probably the hardest thing to do in the modern era, blends great strategic golf course architecture that would be stimulating and challenging but fun for all skill levels with being able to test the pros at the highest level. I mean, I'll talk about my predictions for winning score, but Oakmont's really hard. It's a really hard golf course, and I think it will unequivocally, unless we get a ton of rain and a really firm and fast Masters, will unequivocally play as the hardest major venue this year. Um, I think that of those six, like I said, architectural masterpieces that have hosted a US Open in the last 20 years. And even if you wanted to throw Winged Foot, which I think sits now around, Winged Foot's dropped in the rankings a little bit. The consensus opinion in the architecture community about Winged Foot is a little bit lower than the six courses that I previously just mentioned. But four of these golf courses, Oakmont, Shinnecock, Marion, and Pinehurst, blend both architectural strategic mastery as well as, like I said, one of the toughest things to do in the modern era, really providing a great test for the modern pro golfer. I mean, if you get the right conditions on any of these golf courses, it's a tournament that will naturally be won at 5 under par or even lower, right? Uh, LACC and Pebble Beach, I don't think, as currently constructed, test the pros at the highest level the way that those other four golf courses do for what I hope a US Open to be and what I think most traditional golf fans hope a US Open to be. Um, I'm a tremendous Los Angeles Country Club fan. I think it's one of the greatest golf courses in America. I'm not sold it's the best US Open venue for a number of reasons, right? Marine layer, lack of fan interest in Los Angeles, and then don't get me started on the mowing lines at Pebble Beach and that golf course's current presentation. That's a whole other podcast. So I think any of those four golf courses, to be honest with you, is a really acceptable answer for what the best US Open venue is. And if I was building a US Open rotation, I would start with those four golf courses: Pinehurst, Oakmont, Shinnecock, and Marion. I'm fine with any of the four. I think it's preference. I think what makes Oakmont great, in my opinion, transitioning into talking about the actuality of the golf course, is for member play, it probably has the fastest greens in America. Uh,
Mhm.
Maybe Chicago Golf Club's in that zone. Gosh, the greens at Congaree this past weekend were running 13, so maybe Congaree has a claim for that as well. Um, but but anyway, I think if I was to describe Oakmont, I would say that it is a much better version of Winged Foot. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Because Winged Foot has phenomenal greens as well, right? The star of the show at Winged Foot is the greens. And actually, what really contributed to Bryson having so much success at Winged Foot was the fact that he was approaching those greens with wedges when others were approaching with middle irons and long irons was a tremendous advantage in accessing some of the pins. Um, but I think if I'm starting, and I have a lot of comparisons, so I'm interested to get your take. But I think if I'm starting the conversation at Oakmont, and the case for why Oakmont is recognized in the architecture community as one of the 10, you know, great American masterpieces, these are some of the most fantastic green complexes um, in the world, right? And I think that you are going to see that, how that interacts and plays out in the tournament. I think you are going to notice that right off the bat. I mean, in the first hour of the final round, 2016 US Open, Jason Kokrak hits a drive on the drivable par four, the second hole, which is a fantastic drivable four, by the way. And his drive gets within 10 feet of the pin, but the pin is on a, a slope. Okay. And so the ball kind of reaches this point 10 feet away from the pin and then starts coming backwards. And it ends up rolling 30, probably 30 yards down to a little collection area. Jason Kokrak putts up to try and access that pin at the slope. And the ball almost gets there. It gets probably within 10 feet of the hole again and then rolls back down to his feet. Then he overcompensates it, puts it past the pin, and then he has a downhill 6 foot slider for par that he eventually misses. And that would be the best encapsulation of Oakmont, in my opinion, is that this is a hole, a 310-yard hole, where a player has not once, but twice his ball accessed within 10 feet of the pin on two different shots, and he walks away with a five. So that was my biggest takeaway from Oakmont is, man, there's so much to unpack here with these greens. But what stood out to you about Oakmont in your research?
Well, speaking of that, because I remember that pretty clearly from the telecast, it reminded me a lot of how Pinehurst was last year,
Yeah.
where you had similar situations where, you know, Kokrak hit a phenomenal drive, a great shot, but just based on where the pin was and how the greens are undulated, it rolled back off the green. There was a little bit of unfairness to it. And it just, with the really difficult greenside surrounds and how difficult it is to get up and down with the complexities of the green, how fast and slick they are, you can absolutely make a mess of it. One of the things I remember most from Pinehurst was Sepp Straka. I think everybody loves Sepp Straka at Pinehurst going into the year. It was on hole number 3, another short par 4. And he hit a really good drive around the corner, but it just got in that bunker there. I think if it went like 2 more yards, it would have been perfect. And they end up making like an 8 on the hole because he just completely booted it around. That's exactly what Jason Kokrak there. So, you know, it's got some Pinehurst qualities to as far as the greens are the star of the show at Oakmont. They made a very big point to say that in the telecast there. You know, they also try to make a point that it's got some links qualities to it. I can kind of see it from the standpoint of, you know, the bunkers that they have there. There is a little bit of there's definitely a penalty for being in it. It's not like, okay, you're in a bunker, you still get to the green or even bounce up to it. It truly is for the most part one, a shot penalty. So there's some elements of that in it. But bringing back to Winged Foot, because I think whenever I look at a golf course, I think we all have PTSD about what happened with Winged Foot. Um, as far as just okay, it was just two guys, bomber length was the only thing that mattered.
By the way, and I'll
Is this going
talk
to be
about
another
this.
one?
Do you know who else has PTSD about what happened at Winged Foot is Gil Hanse.
Yes, absolutely. But I think this one is more fair, and everybody wants. When they talk about what happened at Winged Foot, the easy answer is okay, narrow fairways, thick rough, like all that stuff. But one of the other problems with Winged Foot was the inherent unfairness of how the mowing lines were and how the holes are set up. Where, like, let's say you're Webb Simpson, okay? It didn't matter if you hit it dead straight with how firm it was and where the mowing lines was. It was going through the fairway. It didn't matter at that point. Whereas with Oakmont, everything really is right out in front of you. So if you can get it going and have a good combination of length and accuracy, you can keep in the fairway. There is more fairness, I feel like, tee to green. With Oakmont, if you're hitting good shots, that was not really rewarded with Winged Foot. Whereas at that point, it says, okay, well, no one's keeping in the fairway because even if I hit it dead straight, it's going to go into the rough. Might as well just hit over everything and be closer and have that wedge into the green. So there's definitely a lot more fairness, I feel like, to Oakmont, tee to green. But you're right. That's only half the battle. These greens are so difficult to access some of these pin locations. There's an inherent unfairness to it. And it's no surprise too that like somebody actually in the Discord asked, is the putting Augusta or Winged Foot or excuse me, Oakmont more difficult? And I mean, we don't have the strokes gain stats, but just looking at rudimentary data, the field average for 3-putt percentage that week was over 1
Yeah.
per round. And you could see it in the final round. Nobody was making putts. It was so easy just to run a putt by 5, 6, 7 feet and have a really difficult slider coming back. It really is nervy. It keeps you on the edge of your seat the entire telecast because nothing is safe, nothing is guaranteed. Even if a guy is on there in green regulation, he could definitely 3-putt or 4-putt still. So the drama is always there with Oakmont, and it's going to be a good tournament.
And everything, I'm so glad you brought up that point because I want to put a bow on the greens, and then I want to talk a little bit about how I think the golf course has changed from 2023 to 2016 and a little bit more on Gil Hanse. But I think the thing that gets lost with Winged Foot in 2020, and I think this is going to be the case at Oakmont as well. I think if you are an incredible lag putter and an incredible putter in general, you do have a chance to compete at this golf course. And we actually, again, this got lost at Winged Foot. Did you know that Zach Johnson finished T8 at Winged Foot?
Yes.
Did you know, I know you did, but the listeners, you know, Webb Simpson finished T8 at Winged Foot? And the reason why Zach Johnson and Webb Simpson, both two of the shortest hitters on the PGA Tour on a golf course that everyone's conclusion was you need distance to compete here. Now, of course, they didn't win, but Zach Johnson and Webb Simpson both finished 8th at Winged Foot, because they ranked first and second in putting. And this is a golf course that I think really accentuates elite putting skill. So I actually think that this US Open at Oakmont could be the type of tournament where you see Brooks, Scheffler, Bryson finish first, second, and third, and then like fourth place is Denny McCarthy. Because I do think that if you're not going to separate with the typical strategic, the historical power method of Bryson, Brooks, and Rory at U.S. Opens, why those three players have become the most successful U.S. Open players of the last decade, generally because of their power off the tee, their height approaching these greens, their apex height, and their long iron play and their height with their long irons, which played a tremendous factor at Pinehurst, by the way. The two highest ball hitters in the game are Rory McIlroy and Bryson DeChambeau uncoincidentally, they finished first and second at Pinehurst. If you're not one of those things, I don't think you could probably win a US Open at Oakmont not having that skill set. Uh, but I do think that you could separate here with awesome putting. And I guess that would be the anti-Scheffler case, right? Is that somewhat similar to Pinehurst? I think it's in the range of outcomes that he could just go completely in the wrong direction on these greens, because these are, as you highlighted, just as fast and difficult as Augusta. And, you know, Scheffler has no problem at Augusta. So, but he did at Pinehurst. So I think that one could go either way. I don't even want to start talking about the players yet because I have one more thing to talk about on
Well,
Gil.
hold on. I actually have something about the putting.
Okay, good.
I have a counterpoint. So logically, that makes sense. And actually, if you go back to Wingfoot, you're exactly right. You look at two key stat categories we were talking about all week: putting from 5 to 10 feet, three putt avoidance. Bryson was first that season, heading into Wingfoot, 38th in three putt avoidance. Most of that top 10 is comfortably within the top 100. So that, and even from like putting from 5 to 10 feet, a lot of guys putt very well that year. So that passed the test. Go back to Oakmont though. And DJ basically passed that test. 32nd in three putt avoidance heading into the U.S. Open. Only 129 from putting from 5 to 10 feet, though. There's a little bit of noise in there. But the rest of that top 10, though, three putt avoidance. Shane Lowry, 169 heading in.
Interesting.
Scott Piercy, 126. Sergio, 168. Brandon Grace, 147. Jason Duffner, 156. And Zach Johnson, actually, 102. And if you actually go back and look at, because they do keep the rudimentary stats for three putt avoidance, in tournament. DJ was below average putt for three putt avoidance in the tournament. He had averaged about one around. Shane Lowry averaged about one around. Probably about five of them came in the final round, to be fair. But Scott Piercy was one around. Sergio had more than one around. Jason Duffner averaged two around. Yeah. So I guess I agree with you. Logically, that makes sense. But I have an auditor background, and I always have to, if someone makes a claim, I have to test it. And, as soon as I see something like that, where, okay, not only there's data behind it as far as what guys were doing coming in that flies in the face of it, and actually what they did in tournament is a little inconsistent too. I guess what I'm saying is probably use it as a good tiebreaker, but I do still think, just like every other U.S. Open, though, it's still the guys who are best tee to green that avoid the trouble, that stay consistent, smart style, especially a place like Oakmont where things can go really out of whack in a hurry. That, we'll see. It could play out to where that ends up mattering. Maybe the fact that Gil Hands did the greens at Wingfoot, maybe now all of a sudden they're going to matter here. But back at Oakmont, it didn't really quite matter. So
it could even be an Augusta situation where it's so hard. Augusta there's a lot of really strong counterpoints to just the blanket take that you don't need to be a good putter to win at Augusta. There's a lot of noise in that statement, but Sergio, Scotty Scheffler, Hideki Matsuyama, Adam Scott was nowhere near a great putter when he won the Masters either. You could be touching on the point that it just ends up being so hard that if everybody is three putting, then what's the advantage in being an elite putter anyway? It's all just going to come down to the guy that can hit the most greens in regulation and have the closest proximity with his long irons. That's absolutely in play as well. The thing, I have one more point on 2016 and then one more point on Gil Hands, and then we'll talk about the odds board. But the thing that we need to remember from 2016 as well, and this can dovetail into our conversation about scoring and why I think it's going to play really hard, it was soft in 2016. Oakmont wasn't even fully baked out. And so I got in touch with an Oakmont member as I was doing research for this podcast because I wanted to ask him some questions to prepare for what we're going to talk about. And he remembers the 2016 U.S. Open. He was at that US Open. And you know what he told me? Members were actually angry because the golf course was so much softer than it typically plays for member play, which by the way happens all the time. Like the caddy at Congaree was like, yeah, the course conditions that you're seeing today is way harder than they had when they played at Congaree because freaking Keegan Bradley, you can tell this direct anecdote from the assistant pro at Congaree. Yeah, Keegan Bradley shows up to Congaree on Tuesday and is like, these greens are too fast. It's going to be unplayable. So, of course, they coddle these guys to the extreme. But that was kind of the case at 2016 in Oakmont. They got a lot of rain, both pre tournament and tournament week. And so it didn't even play as that firm of a US Open. And you still saw how difficult and devious those greens were. It played 3.6 strokes over par that year. And one player shot better than one under par all week. So if we get a lack of rain, Steve, this year, like if we get a firmer Oakmont, which isn't a big climb from how soft it was in 2016, coupled with the Hans restoration, which not only lengthened the golf course, but really focused on addressing the bomb and gouge issue. I think Oakmont has the opportunity to be, and I'll talk about more briefly about why I don't think you will be necessarily able to do to Winged Foot or to Oakmont what Bryson did to Winged Foot based on some of the bunkering stuff that Gil Hanse added. I think Oakmont does have the opportunity to be the first U.S. Open won at even par or better since. Can you name the last U.S. Open that was won at over even par?
Over even par.
Yeah,
Oh
so like
man,
plus one.
what was it?
We've talked about it.
It was either Marion or that Pebble in 2010, right?
Brooks Shinnecock
Oh, Shinnecock.
2018.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
won
thought
in
he finished
plus
it.
one.
I thought he finished it even. Oh, he's
No, he's
plus one.
plus
Okay,
one. By the
all
way,
right.
2007, Firm Oakmont, Angel
Yes,
Cabrera won at 5 over par. Okay,
yeah.
so like that is what Oakmont can be under firm conditions. Um, Anything on that, Steve, or should I make my final Gil Hanse point?
No, I actually wanted to talk about the bomb and gouge narrative
Yeah,
because people have been talking about it.
yeah,
There ever since after that 2021 US Am, because there was a big deal made about guys playing down wrong fairways and oh, this is only because of how far the ball goes. Well, again, auditor background in me, it's like, okay, why don't we actually like test this theory? Well, first off, if you actually go back and watch that 2021 US Am, I think the setup was a joke. The rough was pretty much non-existent. They got 5 inches of rain. They got more rain than what they got actually in the 2016 US Open. So yeah, it didn't matter if you were in the rough anymore. Guys didn't really care where they were hitting. But also too, like if you actually go and look at the Google Maps about okay, what shot actually did these guys have to hit in order to get to those fairways? Well, all right, so you're playing down one. It's downhill. If you remember that 2016 US Open, you remember Brownie points. He's got the beach ball. He lets it go, and he goes all the way down the hill. It just rolls and rolls and rolls and rolls. And that's why when you look at some of the, like the proximity stats on number one, you see guys that don't get the speed slot. They're hitting from like 200 away, and you got Justin Thomas who's hitting from like 96 yards. But anyways, guys are hitting over onto one to avoid a lot of the bunkering over on the left there. They hit it over there, but it's only like a 280-yard carry. It's downhill. Like that's not really all that unreasonable. It's kind of the similar shot you were hitting at anyway, just going down the fairway there. You know, you had guys playing down the fourth fairway on 3. I saw guys in 2016 doing that. You got guys playing down the 11th fairway on 10. You know, that's basically kind of like, you know, where they're hitting to. It's like a thumbprint, kind of like the Valhalla number 7. Like they're just pin 3-wood basically there. Guys playing down 12, playing on 14. Like the shot, the way people were talking about it was, oh, distance is out of control. Oakmont's obsolete. And maybe just from the standpoint of, okay, like it's not playing how it did like 30 years ago. Like it's not like it's going to be okay. Like if Russell Henley wants to take that strategy, he can do it. It comes down to just if you want to play it that way. Now, you know, granted, I don't know if they're going to want them to play that way. They're probably going to do internal out of bounds because I think if everybody takes those strategies, then place to place can be an issue. But, you know, I mean, if the fairways are run a little firm, you don't really, if you're going to play down that strategy, like you're going to put yourself in probably a bad position. So I'm not really all that concerned about the bomb and gouge strategy that I think people are afraid of. And like you mentioned too, I think just there's enough of a penalty for missing fairways um, to really curb that, and especially with some of the changes that Gil Hands are going to do with some of the bunkering that which addresses that. Um, I don't think it's going to be a wing foot. Obviously distance helps. Probably someone with distance will win, but I mean, I think there's a reason why you saw, some guys that you wouldn't typically think be up there towards the top of a U.S. Open. At least similar to what we've been seeing lately. Maybe we get some similar stuff this year.
So I'm glad you brought that up about the alternate routes of play. And I actually think that because this was a talking point in the 2021 USAM, and I think that this was something that Gil Hanse really spent a lot of time addressing. Like I read some of he didn't really do too many interviews about his 2023 restoration. Um, but there's a little bit of writing on it. There's a couple anecdotes and sound bites. And one of the things that Gil Hanse talked about as it pertains to not only the Oakmont restoration, but as it also pertains to Winged Foot, where he also did the restoration prior to the 2020 US Open, is that he was really surprised about what Bryson did at Winged Foot. He seemed like he was caught off guard. He did not expect Bryson to be able to completely obliterate that golf course. And if you read between the lines, you could tell that Hanse wasn't happy about it. So fast forward to 2023, when Gil Hanse now has another opportunity at restoring a golf course that in many ways is very similar to Wingfoot for the very same reason of what I mean, yeah, he's restoring it for the members, but the biggest thing that he is tasked with is making sure that this is ready to host a US Open. Okay. So Gil Hanse sees what happens to his restoration at Wingfoot and now gets another opportunity at a very similar golf course to make sure that doesn't happen. And the biggest thing that I noticed from this restoration, like all of the writing about this restoration is about not necessarily the greens, because Oakmont's greens were already pretty perfect. You don't have to do that much to the greens. You really don't have to lengthen the golf course that much. But a lot of the things that he talks about was the reshaping of bunkers um, in terms of in the driving areas. And again, if you read between the lines and what it feels like he was super focused on, he doesn't really talk about the greens that much. Like I said, the greens are pretty perfect. What he talks about most is eliminating alternative routes of play, like we saw guys doing in the 2021 USAM. So again, it's still a US Open. I'm still 100% taking distance over accuracy here, like I would at any US Open. But I do not think that Bryson will be able to do to this golf course what he did to Winged Foot. And, if he does, then I don't think Gil Hanse will be a very happy man, because I think one of the things that I'm most excited to watch about this US Open is whether the Bryson effect works, because it seems like this is this is a we talked about the redemptive arc for Shane Lowry. I think this is a Gil Hanse redemptive arc as well. If he can restore a golf course similar to Wingfoot and have it play as tough as he wants it to play while not having it be able to be bomb and gouged through the Bryson route.
Yeah, I think obviously I agree with you. It seems like most U.S. Opens now are won by distance. Um, Looking at the golf course itself, and well, going back to
Well,
16.
I should say, Steve, real quick on that. Pinehurst was an interesting one because I know everyone's going to talk about the distance at Pinehurst, but if you look at kind of the data golf correlations,
Yeah.
Pinehurst was a lot more accuracy than I think people want to admit.
Oh, it definitely was. It played a way heavier hand in how strokes getting off the tee was formulated that week. But just like looking at profiles of guys, and I know golf was different in 2016, but you know, a lot of those guys, obviously you want to look at DJ, big bomber, but he had 64% of his fairways that week. Like he drove it exceptional that week. If they kept track of the strokes getting off the tee numbers, between how far he was hitting in front of everybody and how many fairways he was hitting. He was absolutely hitting it just on a rope, especially on Sunday. So, but other guys like Shane Lowry, above average distance, above average accuracy. Scott Piercy, above average distance, above average accuracy. Sergio, above average distance, above average accuracy. So this might be more of like the total driving, a little bit like the good
Yeah.
drive percentage, because like I mentioned too, like it's not like Winged Foot where like if you hit it dead straight, might go through the dog leg, doesn't matter. This one, for the most part, everything's kind of in front of you. If you hit a good shot, hit a good tee shot, it's going to stay in fairway. So, and especially if the bunkers are a lot more penal with what Gil Hanse did, spraying it everywhere might not work out for you and might penalize you for a little bit. And, I mean, it's not this, it's even though they have lengthened it, it's still not the longest US Open venue. It's still
It's
under
not.
7,400 yards. If you look at what the proximity stats were from at least the final round,
What do you have
um,
for 175 yards plus?
it it's not much. Where's my data on that?
I have 44%, which is
Oh,
sounds like a lot, but it's not crazy for a US Open.
yeah. So it was weird because A, it's final round. B, you're not getting everybody. So basically, I have 10 shots under 150 if you count two of them with the two par fives that were like way over 600 yards, where if you just like miss the fairway, and maybe just because I saw a lot of people miss the fairway, those par fives are basically hacking out and having like wedges in. But I had 6 shots between 175 and 200, and only 2 shots over 225. Like, and those were the
Mhm.
couple of the par three. So
So you're close to me then. You're not
yeah,
far off from that 44% number that I have from 175 yards plus. That makes me feel better.
yeah, which is not crazy, and most of that was confined between 175 and 200. That's not crazy.
Yes.
So, like, it's not a situation where, even if you have a shorter hitter hits in the rough, it happens to be on some one of the holes where it's a little bit shorter iron in, there is opportunities to bounce the ball still up to the green, at least get it there. It's not hack out city at this point. So, this might be more of a U.S. Open where, I mean, maybe length isn't the most important thing, or isn't as important as it was in previous years. Maybe it just is more total driving, consistency, ball striking, all that stuff.
So final thing on Hans too. I mean, Hans has restored now at this point, has a pretty strong resume of major championship golf courses that he has restored in the last 10 years. Um, Winged Foot, we already talked about. We talked about how this golf course may differ from Winged Foot, but for all intents and purposes, there's still a tremendous amount of similarities between Oakmont and Winged Foot. Like
Yeah.
just in terms of what's a long, hard, somewhat narrow, heavily bunkered US Open golf course where the star of the show is still greens that run 14 on the stimp and are heavily undulated. The Winged Foot and Oakmont comparisons still should be there as you should want to look at the 2020 US Open as a somewhat worthy reference point.
Not Torrey Pines. You basically just described that too.
No, Torrey Pines doesn't have quite the greens that I'm
No.
talking about here at Winged Foot and Oakmont. Um, the Country Club, the Country
Yes,
Club,
Brookline.
yeah, the Country Club's a Gil Hanse restoration,
Mhm.
where a lot of the focus was on fairway bunkering, extending fairway bunkering into the landing areas, and then also, and this is a golf course it doesn't have as bold greens necessarily as Winged Foot or Oakmont, but Southern Hills too. I mean, Southern Hills is a Gil Hanse restoration where you look at the makeup of how how Southern Hills was won. Um, I actually think that there could be a lot of similarities there as well. So what I did was I combined Southern Hills. I didn't do LACC. I think LACC had so much more width, somewhat different agronomy, different climate. I think Oakmont's going to be pretty humid. We're not going to have to deal with any marine layer stuff. So I didn't use LACC in this, even though that is also a Gil Hanse restoration for a recent US Open venue. But I looked at Southern Hills Country Club Winged Foot, and then also the 2016 version of Oakmont. G's a number one player at Gil Hanse restored major championship golf courses. He's 100 to 1 right now.
Oh, we're already going to get to him.
We're
We
already
got
going
we
to
got
get to
the
him.
whole top of the board before we have to get to him.
I think it's a bet, Steve.
Do you
I
want
think
to start with him?
Well, let me give you the top 10 and you tell me if
All
anything
right.
jumps out at you. So this is Southern Hills Country Club Winged Foot Oakmont. I call this the Gil Hanse Restorative US Open Major Championship Specialist. Number one, Will Zalatoris. Number two, Dustin Johnson. Number three, Xander Schauffele. Number four, Rory McIlroy. Number five, Seamus Power, which he just like has random top 20s at Brookline and Southern Hills. Six, Bryson. Seven, Matt Fitzpatrick, who obviously won Brookline. Eight, Justin Thomas, who obviously won Southern Hills. Nine, Shane Lowry. 10, John Rahm. Scheffler, you're probably looking for on that list. Um, the two names that you're probably looking for on that list are Scheffler and Brooks. Scheffler was awesome, obviously, at Brookline, but he miscut at Oakmont in 2016 as a baby. That's not really fair. Didn't play Winged Foot in 2020, miscut at Southern Hills. Um, so maybe that's a bit of an anti-Scheffler case. If you're looking for Brooks, by the way, he was just hurt for most of these. So he was hurt at Winged Foot in 2020. He was hurt for Southern Hills in the Country Club in 2022. He's actually quite good at Oakmont in 2016. But does anything stand out to you there? I thought that list was fairly informative.
Well, going back to Scotty for a second, because I've always liked your take that it was, you guys, I think you and Kobe said it on a couple of previews about where Scotty is good and where Scotty kind of short circuits. And it seems like when things don't go according to plan, as far as good shots getting rewarded, some crispy greens, a little bit of unfairness, kind of like what we saw at Pinehurst, kind of like we saw the final round of Troon last year, where things kind of went a little haywire as far as the win and everything. Um, I wonder if Scotty would enjoy this golf course, as far as some of the things that might happen around and on the greens with him, and if that's going to force him into maybe a bad headspace. Because I mean, listen, tee to green. Listen, we talk about really good total driving, combination of length and accuracy, and good iron play and all that stuff. But the greens are the defense, and we've seen when things get a little hairy and dicey on the greens, like it can get at Oakmont, things go off the rails very quickly for Scotty. So that's going to be interesting, I think, to see how that plays out. I mean, Xander's no surprise. Obviously, just a really good U.S. Open track record. Has done well at those U.S. Open venues. He's 11-1 right now. You're already paying a premium. Like, obviously, you wouldn't discount him based on how he played last year. He plays U.S. Opens, but as far as like a no bet. One of the things I did hear on the telecast, and I mean, it makes sense based on who's won at Oakmont. And if you look at some of the tee shots required at Oakmont, very fade bias. Obviously, you have Jack Nicklaus winning at Oakmont. You have Angel Cabrera hitting big, huge cuts, even in
DJ.
2016. Yep, DJ. Shane Lowry hits a lot of cuts. Scott Piercy was hitting a bunch of cuts. Even Sergio was hitting cuts back then. So, you talk about a guy who prefers a fade. Great ball striker, pretty good U.S. Open history. Not great at the Gil Hanse tracks though, but he's really improved his short game. It's not the longest golf course. Morikawa, he's sitting at like 20.
Yeah, maybe. He he didn't like I didn't circle him for
Okay.
whatever reason. I I, I circled him more so at the Masters than here for whatever reason. By the way, I know that I'm not allowed, but it would be very Rory to shoot the boot at Quail Hollow and Portrush in his native home of Northern Ireland. And then this is the major championship that he actually ends up contending at when everybody pencils him in for Quail Hollow and Portrush. Kind of happened at that's happened with Rory in the past, right? Like I think everyone expected him to be there at Valhalla, and then he ends up being there at Pinehurst. Um, the LACC year, I think everyone expected him to do it at Oak Hill, and then he ends up doing it at LACC. It would be very Rory for this to be the golf course that he contends at, and And it's a phenomenal golf course for Rory. I mean, Rory has been for via strokes gained the best. I'm not going to say he's the best U.S. Open player of the last 10 years because Brooks has won two U.S. Opens in the last 10 years. But over the last 10 years, Rory has the highest strokes gain. He's got like seven top 15s in the last nine U.S. Opens. So I guess that transition us to the odd board. I mean, I have a couple of names, but who sticks out to you? Um, I guess at the top and then maybe some long shots. Although, again, this is closer to the Masters, in my opinion, than it is the PGA Championship. Like, I think this is a golf course, particularly to where your window of players that can actually win the tournament generally pretty small at US Opens.
Mhm. Well, there's a big trend too. I think we talk about on our show. I think every single winner of the U.S. Open has been at least top 25 in tee to green heading in.
Yeah.
So you just basically eliminate that. Um, so really, it's going to come down to that. So I sitting here today, where while length is obviously an advantage, it may not be the most as important as other venues. So I kind of looked at some other guys that okay, solid U.S. Open track record. Maybe not the longest guys, but I just think could grind their way to a 4 under, 3 under if it gets really spicy. And some
I
of those types
wonder
of
I
guys.
wonder if we're on one of the same names because
Okay.
you're speaking my language with one guy in the 30s. I think it's a bad number, but I really like this golf course for him.
Okay. So bad number here, but is Hideki just a one major guy?
We're right there, man.
Okay.
Again, I hope we disagree more at Portrush, but Hideki was weirdly looking at me.
Mm-hmm.
Hideki was staring me down from across the room at this golf course. Now he was really good at winged foot. Um, Nothing all that special at Southern Hills or Brookline. He was quite good at as well. Brookline, I believe. So Hideki does have two top, I want to say 15s at Winged Foot and Brookline. Um, I think it's totally in the range of outcomes that Hideki is a two major guy. Of course. How could you not think that's in the range of outcomes? If Hideki finishes his career with one major like Adam Scott or Sergio Garcia, am I surprised? Of course not. But if he gets to two, this would be a pretty damn good golf course for him to do it at.
Yep. I would totally agree between the really good short game, obviously the great iron play, not the longest guy out there, but really solid, steady. And even if you get him on some of these faster greens, like it plays out where just guys
Augusta.
aren't making a lot of putts. Yeah,
Yeah.
Augusta there. Or Murfield Village. He's won there too. He's been very good there. That's a tough golf course with really fast greens.
Mm-hmm.
He's had a lot of success there. So even going back to like, if you just want to think like, classic US Open venues, you mentioned earlier, Marion, he was top 10 back in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe some of these more classic venues might suit his game a little better. Showed a lot better at Wingfoot than the final result did. He had a bad Sunday, but he was, I mean, it really was just a two-man show heading in, but he was solidly inside the top 10
Mm-hmm.
heading into the final round there. So Hideki is definitely somebody that I just feel like could grind their way to a really consistent ball striking performance, doesn't make a ton of mistakes, able to get up and down, and can squeeze one of these out. So I don't think I think the best numbers, you're right, it's around 30. But he would pique my interest if he dips a little more on the odds board and if he's playing relatively well.
I think that's one to monitor to buy the dip on. I don't think the number best I see is 33. I don't think that's a bet you should make now.
No.
But if by some chance Hideki starts slow, I would monitor that US Open for Hideki. I mean, I almost bet the Zalatoris 100. Like, why wouldn't I bet the Zalatoris 100? He almost won at Southern Hills. He almost won at the Country Club. He finished eighth at Winged Foot. If you are just saying to yourself, okay, if he's healthy, we are getting a player at 100 to 1 that almost won the last two major championships at Gil Hanse Restored Golf Course. So, this style of golf, there's clearly something here that clicks with Zalatoris in terms of his engagement in this style of golf and sensibilities. I mean, if he is remotely healthy, how is that not the best bet on the board? He also talked about, hey, picked up. I'm quite dubious on this. Is it true? I'm going to need to see it. And did he play Hero last week? I didn't
No, he was
watch.
actually in South Africa last week.
Yeah. Did you get eyes on this reported gained 15 pounds of muscle situation?
I did. It didn't really translate to the play. But listen, it's his first. I guess my question to you is, what's the downside to betting the 100 to 1 on Zalatoris today? Like, just think about it from like just pure betting standpoint. Okay, if you're somebody who, you know, if your target win on outrights is like winning 10 units, all right, you're risking zero point 0.1 units on
By the
this on
way,
a guy.
can we just Vic lap for 1 second? Are you aware that JT's down to 30 to 1 to win most majors? And
I
we
I
didn't
am.
hop on it. I hopped on Cantlay, by the way, I should say.
I did
After
too.
our pod, I just bet the Cantlay 40 and said screw it. Um, kind of wish I was holding a J. I know he looked pretty poor on Sunday at the Hero, but I think if you're holding a 55 to 1 on Justin Thomas at the Masters or Quail Hollow, I suppose, for that matter, you should be feeling pretty good. And we did have a couple people, I know you're not on Twitter, but I had a couple people reach out to me in the DMs that said, thanks for the JT shout. He's already almost half his number.
Yeah, I mean, congrats everybody. I did not get the
No.
JC number. I saw you went on Cantlay. I wasn't going to do it. I'm like, you know what? I can't. I would not be able to sleep if I saw you do it and we talked about it. And I'm like, nah, I'm going to do what I always do. I'm just going to wait. The JT one, I mean, look, play great. Already down to 30 to 1. I'm not going to lose sleep over it. With the Masters, it's going to come down to I'm just going to try and construct a betting card with just, I feel like just the three best players, I think, up until that point. If I want to bet JT, I'll find a way to do it. Like
Mhm.
you can do it. But as far as like the 100 to 1 is Zalatoris, like what we just mentioned, like if you're somebody looking to win like 10 units an hour, it's zero point 0.1 units. Like, are
Mhm.
you really going to lose sleep if that doesn't come to play? Like, it just is playing like crap. Just throw it out at that point. You want to make up that zero point 0.1 units, go bet an NBA game or something like that. Like, it's different than saying, okay, I'm going to lock in 30 to 1 on Zalatoris like he is at the Masters with a ton of downside. Like, if Zalatoris is bad, you throw away a 101 ticket, just regroup and just start over at that point. But the ceiling is completely massive because, like you mentioned, great U.S. Open record, great U.S. Open track record at Gil Hanse golf courses. And we are just 1 year away from he had a really good run from Bay Hill to Riviera to Augusta, where he was playing some excellent golf where we thought he was back. So it's in there somewhere. He just has to get a little more consistency. And at 100 to 1, like that can open up so many possibilities if you're holding that today and you are right on it. And if you're wrong, whatever, it's okay. You're not going to lose sleep over it. So I did bet the 100 to 1 just for the ceiling. And if it doesn't pan out, then screw it, whatever. I'll figure it out and, with some other guys, at that point.
I just bet it as you were speaking.
There you go.
Yeah, official play number 2 for us for the December majors preview pod. We're holding 40 to 1 on Cantlay at the Masters and 100 to 1 on Zalatoris at the US Open. We're somehow an hour into Oakmont and I've got through like 70% of my notes. Royal Portrush will undeniably be shorter because I have less strong opinions on Portrush, but give me any names that we haven't mentioned and then your December 1st pick to win the US Open.
I mean, just looking down the board here, I mean, a guy who can play some tough golf courses, Robert McIntyre. I know his U.S. Open record is all that good, but he showed he could win twice last year, has some pedigree at some of the majors. If it really is kind of like a tough grinding contest, you could do that. Davis Thompson finished ninth last year at Pinehurst. Good driver, got some length. Relatively accurate as far as how as far he can put it out there too. Young guy, played that wing foot U.S. Open, didn't do all that great, but I mean, he showed he can do well in a venue like that last year. Showed a lot of upside last year. He's 120 to 1. If you just think length is still all that matters, Taylor Pendrith, making a little bit of noise there too, like down to like 270 to 1. But I don't feel all that inclined to bet these guys, but those are ones I kind of have
This is
highlighted just to
Kyle's
say
favorite
like,
part of the podcast, by the way. He's so happy that you brought up Taylor Pendrith 270.
I think he's good. He's a good player, but I don't know. Maybe he can have like a Woodland type career where he's kind of, maybe like he kind of like matures a little bit, maybe mid 30s, late 30s, he kind of hits his peak. Um, but that's somebody I think as far as like, if it really just is about all about distance, kind of like what it is, the last few winners of the U.S. Open, he obviously has that great driver, good ball striker. I think he played pretty well at Winged Foot too. So if you want to make that comparison as well, as far as the greens and the Gil Hanse connections, that could work for you as well. But otherwise though, I mean, it's kind of like with the Masters where you really can weed out a lot of guys at the beginning of the tournament as far as just what the trends are, as far as the ball striking stats, tee to green stats, as far as okay, it's really comes to this particular bucket here, and then you kind of pick from there. But yeah, those are just some of the names I kind of have my eye on, down the card right now, but um, not all that inclined to bet at this point.
So I'll keep it even more simple than you and just actually pose this question back to you. Isn't at this point it's kind of stupid to not pick Scotty Scheffler to win a major? Like, I'm not sitting here saying that I'm putting a tremendous amount of stock into him winning the Hero or anything, although there is a lot of buzz about the claw grip. But at this point, if your argument is Scotty Scheffler is going to go 0 for 4 in the majors, I mean, I get it. I am the king of golf is hard. There's a ton of variance, but it, I feel like you're almost trying to be overly contrarian if you're going to say that Scotty Scheffler isn't going to win a major. I mean, it's certainly possible, and I'm not super psyched to bet a plus 550 number, although that is a better number than he went off at last year's U.S. Open. And I don't think that's getting any, I don't think that's getting much better. So,
I
I'll give you my pick because I because we'll move on to Portrush. But I mean, I I think you're being overly contrarian to not pick Scotty Scheffler to win a major in 2024, and I don't think he's going back to back at the Masters. I like this golf course better for him than Quail, and I don't think he's winning the Open. So this would be the spot for me. By the way, I talked about earlier on my mailback episode with our producer Cam. I think this is the most likely Kepka spot too. Like I think Kepka is 25 to 1 on FanDuel to win the US Open. I think if Kepka's winning a major this year, it's here, personally. So
Yeah.
Scotty and Brooks, I think this would be the spot for them, in my
Okay.
opinion.
Yeah. I mean, look, I'm not trying to be contrarian by not picking Scotty. I made the point about
I
speculating,
know, I know, I
but
know,
tee to
I
green, I have
know.
no concerns about. This is a perfect golf course from tee to green here.
And
So
by the way, like the contrarian concept around Scotty at Pinehurst ended up paying massive dividends. Okay. Scotty was penciled in at Pinehurst at resounding levels by myself included. And it really felt ballsy at that US Open to say that Scotty Scheffler isn't going to win. And he finished T42. So, of course, he cannot win a major in 2025. I'm picking him to win one. I think there's some people out there that may pick Scotty Scheffler to win 2 or 3 majors. I'm picking him to win one. I'm going to say it comes at Oakmont.
okay. See, I think actually maybe we should talk about this at PGA or the last show. I feel like as far as like predictability, as far as like homogeny, as far as like just where things just won't go wrong. I mean, it might be just Quail Hollow for him, but
Yeah.
that's another conversation. But I mean, I mentioned Colin earlier. I think I'll make that my official pick. I think a lot of these tee shots are going to fit his eye. I love the fact that he's really improved his short game. I don't really have a ton of concerns about him really on really fast, difficult greens because he puts really well at Augusta. Um, I'll make him my official pick.
So for Masters, did we both go Cantlay, or did
No,
you
you
pick
went.
some?
I went Rom. You went Cantlay, but we bet Cantlay.
Yeah. So
Now I went Bryson for the PGA.
and I went Hovland for the PGA. So
Yeah.
then, okay, that's good because the first two you picked somewhat more obvious ones than and I'm picking the super obvious one. Not that Colin Morikawa probably won't go off at 20 to 1 or whatever, but okay, sweet. Let's take a quick break and then we will dive into Royal Portrush. All right, we are back. Royal Portrush time, final major of the year. Probably the hardest futures market to bet into now because of the weather, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not going to stop us from breaking down the golf course till we're blue in the face. Although, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, I'm pretty pliable on Portrush. I mean, I spent a lot of time watching 2019 and talking to people that have played Portrush and watching some other YouTube videos. There's really not many stats from the 2019 Open that we can look to with a ton of confidence. I'm really excited to talk to you about this one because I have some ideas about Royal Portrush, but they're all semi loosely held. So um, let me kick it to you. What stood out to you in your research about Royal Portrush?
Well, just from a high level, the problem with handicap in the US or the Open Championship now is, like you just said, weather. And one thing I kind of noticed, maybe it's just small sample size, but like the last 4 or 5 Opens, the ones where it was pretty soft, benign, not all that difficult scoring conditions like Royal St. George or St. Andrews, and a little bit is golf course related, but the weather conditions were pretty good. And it seemed like those leaderboards that kind of shook out, pretty chalky. Basically, the guys were, pretty mainstream names, ends up rising to the top. It just doesn't feel like your true Open. But then you have the bad weather Opens, like Troon last year, or even this one, where it got really bad weather in the final round. Like that's when you have the opportunity, you look at the leaderboard, you're like, how the hell is JB Holmes up there? Or last year, how is Justin Rose? Like, I know he's been great at the Open, but like he's been dog shit for 3 months. Billy Horschel's up here, Henley's up here. Like, you got all these just different types of guys because at the Open, especially when the weather gets really bad, you see, I think the guys who feast on PGA Tour type setups or the big brawny major setups where it just is different type of golf and different skill sets are valued. And that's why it's so hard because if we're in good weather, and you kind of saw the support rush in the second and third round, where it's pretty easy scoring condition. You can definitely get it going. But
Mm-hmm.
first and fourth round, really difficult. We'll talk about that fourth round. That's one of the challenges as well is, you know, with the US Open, and I didn't mention it earlier, like a lot of people dunked on the Fox coverage for years. That's just so good how it was presented back then with all the graphics and data and like little bells and whistles they had. This what I had available for the Open though, there was a final round that you could watch. There was no graphics.
Mm-hmm.
It was the international feed. You basically were relying on, and I had to listen to what they were saying as far as like, okay, he has this club from this distance, and they wouldn't always say it. So it was very hard to really pick up exactly what was going on as far as distances in the greens or, what they kind of face with everything. So, or even just what shots were for, as you're watching. So that's a big mystery as far as just opens in general, and especially at this place that doesn't really play like a real links. I mean, it's a links, but like it doesn't play like how a lot of these venues typically are. Like, for example, a
It was
lot of
really
elevate.
green.
Well,
Like I was
yeah,
watching a Rick Shields video from like a couple months ago, and the golf course was just really green to me.
yeah.
It wasn't brown. It wasn't brown,
Well, I
which is
think that's part of, and they talked about a little bit of how with Troon last year, comparing contrasting the agronomy from the west coast of Scotland versus the east coast. It's a little hardier grass because the weather's a little different there. And you got Portrush, which basically is right across the Irish Sea there. So similar type of area as far as like the type of weather systems that move in there. And you saw that, the RNA was definitely not shy as far as growing the rough up. But as far as the actual piece of land goes, a lot of pretty good elevation changes. As far as like uphill shots, downhill shots, one of the things I remember them saying that really differentiated itself from other open venues was it was more of an aerial game, especially with how perched up some of these greens are.
Yeah.
You see some open venues where you just, you can bounce the ball to the green. There's a bit of an element of a recovery shot. Even if you're in the kind of the wispy rough there with a bad lie, you can bounce it up there. Here, though, you couldn't really do that, especially with how thick some of the rough was. And the green side surrounds also, I felt like, especially on like hole number 2, were a little more severe than I think some other venues I've seen recently. So, there wasn't the opportunity to putt back up to the surface. You had to chip over a couple of mounds. It seemed like a lot more of a difficult task if you missed the green there. So it's different. It's a different venue than I think some open venues we've seen. Obviously, you got the weather concerns. It's a beautiful piece of property.
It
Um,
is thought of, Steve, in the architecture community as one of the 10 to 15 greatest golf courses in the
mhm.
world. I mean, I was spent this last weekend on a golf trip with folks that are far more well traveled than I. I mean, I'm pretty well traveled, and I felt completely emasculated in the golf group that I was in because they've seen every golf course in the world from New Zealand to the tips of Northern Ireland, and they spoke incredibly highly of Royal Portrush as like this is one of the great. I mean, Harry Colt. Many believe Harry Colt to be the best to ever do it. Right. So, I think Royal Portrush would be super super high on my list. It is super super high on my list. I don't know if there's 10 golf courses in the world I would be more excited to see than Royal Portrush. One of them is Royal County Down in Northern Ireland. So that area in general is just thought of very highly. But I don't know on an open venue. I mean, some context that we should have added is that prior to 2019, there was a 68-year absence from the last open. This was not a venue that was in the rotation. And to be honest with you, the success of Darren Clark and Rory McIlroy was pretty instrumental in the Open coming back to Northern Ireland because this is not a golf course that we have 10 opens at over the last couple of years and over the last couple of decades, and we can say, okay, when we got no weather, this was the score. When we got crazy weather, this was the score. We really have that 2019 where Shane Lowry shot 15 under par, won by 6 strokes over Tommy Fleetwood. Scoring average was plus 1.17, which is not crazy hard by any means. I mean, that's easier than certainly easier than how Troon played last year. You really had two quite hard rounds, round 1 and round 4, where the scoring average was around 2 strokes. And then in rounds 2 and 3, played around even par.
Mhm.
Which is not uncommon for any open, by the way. I mean, the Open Championship has been won at 8 under par or better each of the last 10 years. Uh, but I mean, based on the weather we got in 20, like, do you think that was hard weather for this golf course? Because that's what I was trying to think about is like, okay, I watched a lot of 2019 and it was pretty windy, it was pretty rainy, and it was 15 under par, probably more like realistically 10 under par because Lowry did win by 6 strokes. But I don't know whether we should be looking at 2019 and saying it's going to play easier or harder than 2019 because they didn't really make any changes to the golf course either. Too many changes to the golf course. I mean, when you watch 2019, did that weather you feel like play hard to you, or do you think it's in the realm of possibility that this golf course could play way easier or way harder compared to the weather conditions that we saw in 2019? Because that was one of the things I was struggling with.
Well, the final round, yes. That golf course played a lot longer, especially. So I think the wind was coming from the, trying to remember the compass, the west at that point, and there's a lot of holes that were playing into the wind going that way. So like guys would pull driver and it was like a 430-yard hole, but they still would have 180, 190 into the
Hmm.
green. The
Hmm.
rain, it was cold that day too. The ball just wasn't going anywhere.
Hmm.
So that's a challenge. Is if that's really the only thing you're going to watch, then you're going to assume, oh my god, this is the most impossible golf course ever, especially when the wind and the rain and it's a disaster. But you got to remember too, Shane Lowry shot 63 the previous day. You know, he had a couple
Hmm.
guys shoot 65 pretty comfortably on Friday. So, it just this golf course definitely I feel like can be had in the good weather conditions, but yeah, when the wind starts blowing, especially with how the inability, if you're out of position off the tee, to be able to recover and bounce the ball up to the green like some other venues, like you're probably going to end up in a pretty bad location off the green. Like there's so many par threes that like I saw guys miss like short right and they're way below the putting surface and it's an awkward chip back up and they got this kind of messy weeds they're kind of hidden out of and like the ball's dead coming out of it, and that and the slow greens, it can get very difficult in a hurry there. So,
Sure,
that
but 2.25 final round scoring average, that's a stroke easier than the first 2 days at Royal Troon. Like, do you think that all things equal, this is a harder golf course than Royal Troon?
no, I think Troon is a much harder golf course, and also, I think it's also keep it
Agreed.
important. It's important to keep in mind too that final round, the bad weather came late in the day,
Yeah.
so it was more manageable in the beginning of it. But I think just looking at some of the scores, I mean, obviously the most famous one you remember is JB Holmes going from second to I think he shot an 87 that day. You had Brooks starting out with four straight bogeys to start the day. I know Henrik Stenson didn't play all that great because I'm a Stenson guy and he ended up shanking one. I know Rose hit a shank. He shot 79. So if you just isolate the late afternoon there, yeah, it played extremely difficult. But there were some guys also that went out early. I think Hatton went out early. He shot a 69 that day, gained four strokes in the field. Robert McIntyre finished before everybody, ends up rising up the leaderboard. So again, it's just going to depend on if the weather is not all that bad. I definitely think this can be had. But if in bad weather conditions, especially on with 16, 17, and how if you were missing fairways when the rough is really wet, it's really hard to get out of it. It can definitely be. It's not as hard as Troon. Troon is harder, but it can be very difficult.
Yeah. I just think that the current version of the Open Championship, I think that links golf courses have struggled the most to keep up with modern technology in terms of, Royal Portrush is such a great golf course, and so many of the open venues are such great golf courses that you can't really tear those places up at the seams. And I mean, St. Andrews at this point basically has tee boxes and cow pastures. There's only, the fact that the Open Championship, our singular, most highly thought of, the champion golfer of the year, our oldest championship. This is a tournament that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s used to be routinely won at around even par. And I thought Royal Troon was about as hard as it got last year. Like that played 3.5 strokes over par. Xander still won at 9 under par, and we now have a 10-year streak going of the winner needing to get to at least 8 under par. And over the last 10 years, it's not like we haven't had weather, right? Like there have been open championships across the last 10 years that have been won at 13 under par with pretty spicy conditions. So I'd be highly speculative that this golf course can't be pretty easy. I especially with the aerial attack of like, is the comp St. George's? Because St. George's was Morikawa 15 under par, that played easier than 2019 0.5 scoring average. I think in general, this is going to play harder than St. George's. St. George's barely got any weather at all. But, when I think of that open at St. George's, that was really an aerial attack too. I mean, that golf course didn't play that firm and fast at all. It really turned into a dart throwing contest won by the best iron player in the world at the time in Colin Morikawa. Um, I think it's in the range of outcomes that maybe this is the Morikawa spot. I think that this golf course, again, highly speculative that this would be my bet for the easiest major of the year, I guess I should say.
I mean, it's kind of cheating, though. I mean, you got
Yeah,
the other three venues of like,
yeah. I
yeah.
know, I get it. Not the hottest of takes by any means. Do you know the can you name, we'll do little trivia corner.
Sure.
What was the last Open Championship won at over par?
Was it Carnoustie in 2008?
It was 2008, but in
Wrong venue.
2008 it was played at Royal Birkdale.
Oh,
What
that's it.
can
Birkdale.
can do you know who won?
In 2008, it was Patrick Harrington, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Patrick Harrington,
Mhm.
2008. So, I mean, it's not a super long golf course, par 71, 7,200-ish yards. Uh, it's truly impossible to do proximity without the wind.
I got some data on that. I mean, it's very small, but
Did you seem pretty middle iron intensive with all those like par fours in the 420 to 450 zone? I saw a lot of shots coming between 125 and 175 and pretty still some long irons, the par fives, I think at least two of the three are reachable. But I
Mhm.
think if I'm banking on one thing, I think if you're an awesome middle iron player, you're gonna really like this golf course. And I think that's pretty reflective of the 2019 leaderboard.
Yeah. So basically, and it's also important to keep in mind of the rain conditions and the wind coming out of the wherever it was. A lot of these shots were into the wind, and especially the tee shots, it made it play longer. But I charted based on the guys I evaluated, which unfortunately is like, once Lowry kind of ran away with it, they kind of stopped showcasing a bunch of guys, but just like kind of estimating the golf course and what I actually heard them tell guys, 10 shots between 150 and 200 yards. So, basically kind of like what you just said,
Mm-hmm.
middle irons.
Yep.
So, which is that's kind of the iron proximity bucket I kind of think of for like classic open championships, kind of that range right there. You got to hit those really good over and over and over. And you had a lot of those this week. Obviously, like you mentioned, the par fives are definitely reachable. Um, you have in those the over 200, you had number 16 that played, I think it was, well, they played at 208 in the final round, but it was because it was a 25-mile-per-hour headwind. But they played it up to 230. It's uphill, one of the hardest par threes. It's, in the open rotation there. So, that's another difficult long iron hole there. As far as clubs they're hitting off the tee, it's pretty split. 8 drivers, 6 lesson driver. Seems like in the middle of the round, we're hitting more driver a little more often. Beginning of the round and late in the round, they're kind of be a little more conservative based on where some of the fairway runouts are, where some of the bunkering was. They're tiptoeing a little bit, but kind of even split as far as driver or not. So, um, I mean, I don't, I, as far as how the 2019 leaderboard shook out, not really all that surprised as far as the type of profile kind of elevated. It didn't really favor your chalky, you know, typical mainstream type of guy. Kind of just,
Lowry
yeah,
was a surprise.
he was.
He was
Yeah.
playing really well, but he had missed his last three cuts in opens,
Mhm.
but he did finish runner up at the Canadian Open, eighth at the PGA at Bethpage, third at Harbour Town, and then he won earlier that year at Abu Dhabi. So he was playing very well, but there were definitely a lot of concerns about him still. I think this one speaks to me as the most likely that we could see uh, a long shot, right? And I think that's what we got even last year a little bit. Xander, of course, was not a long shot, but in terms of the makeup of the rest of the top 10, once you get past the winner, there were the most surprises in the top 10 last year at the Open, more so than any other major. I mean, Dan Brown was leading the Open for a long time. It looked very viable that Thurston Lawrence could win the Open Championship at one point, as well as Dan Brown, as well as Billy Horschel, as well as my guy Russell Henley, who could not get a putt to drop to save his life on Sunday, but was second in the field in tee to green behind Xander Schauffele. Um, I think this could be we could see some chaos here, maybe.
Well, 2 points. First, you mentioned that RBC Canadian Open. That was at Hamilton Golf and Country
Harry
Club.
Colt.
Harry Colt there too.
Mm-hmm.
And then second, I mean, even Xander obviously was one of the favorites, but I in no remote universe did I even think at a Open Championship in bad weather at that golf course that took driver out of your hand a lot that Xander's the one that ends up winning after we saw Chalk get murdered at
Mm-hmm.
Troon, where all these big names, all these what people call ball speed imposters, got absolutely blown out to sea. Xander ends up winning, so even that is a surprise. So yeah, it's just, this is the Open that, especially when you throw in weather, expect the unexpected. So this definitely is one where go down the odds board, start thinking about the guys that, we've seen this with some open champions where they just start peaking before, especially with some of their iron play. And you think about some of the events they're leaning in, like Travelers and John Deere and the Scottish, and even going back to like Colonial, Murrayfield Village, like that little stretch there, start thinking about guys that, you know, tend to play well in that little stretch, play well, maybe some Canadian Opens, your harbor towns, like those types of tracks that kind of value more middle irons and not necessarily the driving, especially if the weather's going to be a little adverse. And that's where you can kind of expand your imagination and say, okay, and that's how you end up with a Brian Harman wins an Open. That's how you end up winning with Francesco Molinari is the best player on the planet and ends up winning the Open there. Like guys just get hot for little stretches that kind of are just really consistent ball strikers that have these attributes about these golf courses that fit them. And then, you can take some long shots then.
And that's not us saying either that we think that anybody can win this event. Like it is one, I mean, the trend is not as strong as like the Masters, for example, but over the last 10 years, every single Open champion has still been, one of the 30 best players in the world outside of Brian Harman, although Brian Harman was playing really well. Like he
Yes.
was the highest owned cheap player in DraftKings that week. I know a number of folks, including our friend Brian, that were on him that week at big numbers. Don't get me wrong, it was a shock. I think the shock was more so the way that he did it also in dominating fashion. But I don't think, I guess what I'm saying is you can go farther down the board here, but I still don't think that if you're not playing well, you're going to find it on the links, right? Like you're going to be, if you don't have the answers to the test, you're not going to magically find it at a golf course in a ton of wind where the ball is on the ground a ton. Although this golf course doesn't seem to play quite as firm and fast as some of the other Open Championship venues. So who knows? I mean, anything else on the golf course before we talk about who we may think when?
No, I mean, I could be completely wrong on this, but I don't know if it even can just based on where it's located geographically.
Play as firm and fast as like, I don't know. St. Andrews is a bad example because St. Andrews is just way too short. Like there's too many drivable fours for that
like
golf course.
Carnoustie that one year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think just that area of Northern Ireland, Scotland on the west coast there, just based on the type of weather systems that come in, I don't think it really can play that firm. So, but I could be wrong on that. Somebody could definitely correct me on it. But
Everything I've seen, Steve, I've
yeah,
watched now 6 or 7 different YouTube videos of people playing Portrush at different times of the year. Just spent some time with people that have played Portrush as well. It's not a brown golf course. Like at
no.
least like St. Andrews was browning out during that Open Championship. This to me, I mean, what open venue do you think this is the most similar to? St. George's?
No, I was thinking more Birkdale. As far as just like you have a lot of these fairways and kind of framed by sand dunes and like kind of big grassy areas. But it like I mentioned though, I think this open venue just with how I mean some of the downhill tee shots you got to hit, some of the um how raised a lot of these greens are. It's different. I think it's just a completely different layout than some of the things you see other places. I don't really think there is a good comp. I think it just kind of is what it is. Like I can't think of any other open venue with these raised greens just far above, some of the collection areas. Like maybe Royal Liverpool a little bit with some of the changes they made to it, but like, it really when they said it's an aerial game, like
It's not similar to St. Andrews.
no,
Yeah. I mean,
it's not Carnoustie, it's not
no.
Troon. It's not. I don't. Even think Royal St. George is like the first 7 holes. Definitely a little quirkier. I could see probably that, but like once you get past that, it kind of turns into a little bit bland, at
Even
least on the
did you
black
did
nine.
you notice the off the fairway stuff at Portrush?
Mhm.
It's different. It's almost like we see this a little bit. It reminded me of the golf course that I play in Lake Placid, where it's just kind of overgrown green grass,
Yeah,
and it's almost like there's little flowers in the grass. Like it's not your typical high fescue. Um, I think it
yeah.
seemed a little more playable to me. I don't think we'll deal with as high of a missed fairway penalty at Portrush as we did at Troon. Did it seem like recovery shots from the thick stuff felt a bit more manageable than Troon at least?
Well, I think a big difference with Troon in this place was the bunkers at Troon were true penalties. Like
Yeah.
that's
Yep.
just you're splashing out. Here, you could get out of it. So that is a big difference as far as if you find yourself there, you still get yourself the green. It's not easy because you can't really bounce the ball to the green as easily as some other places. But I they at least some the shots I saw and how wet the rough was in the final round, it did seem like guys were having pretty fair share of trouble getting out of it, at least getting it to the green. Now, if it was drier, probably a different story. It's probably a lot easier and more manageable at that point. So I think it just kind of depends on how wet the golf course is at that point. If it's going to be as easy, but the missed fairway penalty at Portrush very likely is a lot less than a Troon.
Agreed.
I would
So,
agree.
so I just ran a super quick model where I just took, okay, what's the one thing that we can bank on? Be a great middle iron player.
Uh,
So I just took middle iron play and performance in the UK and Ireland and performance in bad weather and the wind. Um, can you guess who's number one?
Bad weather, wind, middle iron player.
Yeah. It's not a crazy name.
Is it Rom?
Xander.
Okay, Xander. Okay. Really in bad weather.
Yeah.
That must
I
all be
mean,
true then.
a lot of it is, I'm
Yeah.
sure. Um, Rory number two.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You know who's number three? A guy that I wins me a ton of money at the Open every single year is Jason Day.
You're more of a Jason Day fan than I am, I think.
Only at the Opens. I mean, he's just
Fair.
yeah, he
It's
plays
fair.
really well at Opens. Um, couple other names: Adam Scott,
Yep.
Billy Horschel, Tyrrell Hatton.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, what I noticed with the odds board, maybe we just get right to
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Like
let's get into it.
all those names where you want to say like Hatton or Fleetwood or
Terrible
Robert
numbers,
McIntyre, you're all playing a premium at this point. Like
which is
Robert
stupid
McIntyre
because
is
they
under.
never win.
Well, yeah, but like I mean, we just saw with the U.S. Open, we just saw about Robert McIntyre. I speculate like, all right, 100 to 1, maybe, but nah, he's sub 40 to 1 for the Open Championship. Hatton's under 30 to 1. Tommy Fleetwood's pushing close to 20 to 1.
Tommy Fleetwood's 22 to 1 at FanDuel. Like,
Yeah.
what are we doing? How is Tommy Fleetwood still half the price of Patrick Cantlay, who's been better in Open Championships recently?
Well, and you're a Fleetwood guy too. Was
Yeah,
that pretty? Was that
yeah,
painful rewatching that final round? Because there was a vibe. I picked it up as soon as he hit the opening tee shot, and he had every opportunity on that first hole to flip the script. Lowry played that hole like a complete donkey, hitting a terrible drive left, leaves it short in the bunker, ends up making bogey. Fleetwood stiffs it and has, I think, 6 feet for birdie. But I noticed walking off the tee box, like he's got his hands in his pocket, his head's down. Like there was some negative energy coming off him. I don't know if it was the fact that he was down so much heading into the final, he just felt defeated. His putt didn't sniff the hole, and he couldn't make a putt all freaking day either. It was just the same typical Tommy Fleetwood bullshit. I feel like we've seen over and over encapsulated in that final, but that was absolutely there for him to really take it. Lowry did not start off very well. He was very shaky. It looked like he was going to have another Oakmont, but it was typical Fleetwood, just as my co-host says, flaccid Fleetwood.
mm-hmm,
He just never got going. The body language looked awful on him that day. I'm not sure really what happened because
mm-hmm.
a couple of putts go in, it's a different story, but it just seemed like he was defeated from the jump.
Yeah, well, I also last year when we did this, my December pick was Tommy Fleetwood, and I stuck with it the week of. He was playing great heading into last year's Open. I think I bet him at 25 to 1, which is probably one of the worst bets I made for the entirety of last year. I actually had a really good Open in DraftKings, but the Tommy Fleetwood bet was fairly unforgivable. I'm not going to pick Tommy Fleetwood this year. I'll keep it pretty simple. I think Rom's gonna win. I think Rom's gonna win. I think we both are pretty bullish on Rom next year. I think Rom will win a major. You already picked him at the Masters. I'll pick him at the Open. Rom finished seventh at the Open last year. Rom finished second at the Open in 2023. He finished third at Royal St. George's in 2021, which I might be a little bit still more in on that comp than you. And then he also finished 11th at Royal Portrush in 2019. So, for all we make about Rom's temper and almost the thing we're starting to say about Scheffler, which is a kind of unquantifiable, more anecdotal about, Rom gets flustered, he has a temper, maybe, but it has translated to some really solid results on links golf courses. I mean, if you just even extend it past the Open Championship, he's played some phenomenal golf at like the Irish Open too.
Mhm.
So, and maybe the comp that we want to be looking at is Royal County Down, because that's another Northern Ireland golf course that was designed by Harry Colt and has hosted not Open Championships, but I think County Down probably plays more as a links in terms of the ability to run shots up and not as much of an aerial attack at County Down as there is at Portrush.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm going with Rom. Thoughts, reactions?
Well, so I was gonna break a rule and actually go Rom double major.
Ooh, interesting,
Masters Open. I think Rom's gonna have a huge year.
dude. That is,
I I
yeah, it's
I
a
I
take.
so I bet Rom in 2019 here because I believe, and actually I was gonna go with the comp. He had just won the Irish Open at Lahinch, which
Mm-hmm.
has similar qualities for
One of my favorite golf courses in the world, Steve. I have
yeah,
played
which
Lahinch.
which
I
I
do
believe
not have
has
enough.
a lot of the qualities of like the aerial game a little bit.
little bit.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and it had bad weather that final round, and he just murdered the golf course. Anyways, it was raining sideways, didn't matter, and so that's why I thought, oh, he's ready. Like this is going to be it. And he played pretty well the first two rounds, but then Saturday, just it was one of those Rom rounds where he missed a couple putts. He starts slamming the putter head, couldn't get that going, and then just Sunday didn't go great for him. He still finished 11th. Um, as far as just like you know the Open Championship history, how I'm just bullish on him for in 2025. Um, you know, I know we don't get a ton of strokes gain data from, well, we don't get strokes gain data from Liv. Just the only thing we have on him is just whenever he plays the majors. But just in general, like I know he was always pretty good with his middle irons. With the aerial game as well, great short game. Um,
Hatton.
yeah, they and one other thing too is like at Oakmont, I noticed that fades off the tee, except for a couple holes where it was the preferred shot shape.
Hmm.
So that all kind of led to Rom double major. I think he's gonna have a huge year, and um, I mean, you picked him for the Open, so I gotta
Yeah,
go
it's a,
somewhere else.
yeah. You gotta go somewhere else.
Okay.
You really don't, but you
No, I
know,
will, I will, but I love the Rom pick.
maybe I'll give
Um,
you Rom if you allow me to pick Rory,
okay, you know what?
who
Why
who,
don't I
who
piss
who I'm staring at the solo second at Royal County Down this year, which he actually blew that one
All
completely.
right. How about this? How about I go down the board? How about I piss a lot of people off?
Okay.
All right. How about Tom Kim 40 to 1? Let's go with that. Good open
What
track record. Did
what's the
well at Hamilton.
case?
Good open track record. Did well at Hamilton Golf and Country Club, similar to what Lowry did. Fits the mold of just, doesn't have as much length, but he's a good iron player, decent open track record. And just, I think this has been his best major as far as his performances because he did
Mhm.
well at Liverpool. I think he did well last year as well. So I'll go with Tom Kim as the pseudo surprise, but really it's Rom. Okay, it's really Rom. That's really the pick.
Yeah, Tom Kim finished runner up in 2023.
Yep.
Missed the cut last year,
All right. So
but
my apologies.
2023 was Royal Liverpool, the Harmon year. Um, yeah, I mean, the names that I mentioned a little bit farther down, again, I'm always a Jason Day guy. Do you feel like we have given Xander enough love on the on this 2025 majors preview? Like if Scotty Scheffler didn't exist, we would be talking about, the not only the best player in the world, but fairly dominant stretch of golf from Xander. I mean, he by strokes gained and the fact that he won two freaking majors last year, and I think neither of us are picking him because we do expect regression, but we expected that's how the Scheffler thing started out, right? We kept expecting regression and it never happened. And I don't think Xander is Scheffler by any means. And I don't think that he is going to win three majors in 2 years. But I don't know if we've given him enough respect on this 2025 majors preview, just in case our friend Nagels is listening.
Well, it's shocking because I think we're both Xander guys. We got to
Yeah,
give
I mean,
respect.
as much of a Xander guy as you could be without betting him at either the two majors that he won, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the difference with we've talked about Scotty, where we were waiting for him to emerge and hit that ceiling because he had such a phenomenal amateur and junior career, and then he finally hit it. Where Xander, we had just a long period of just really good play, but it didn't seem to ever like vacillate as far as like breaking through the ceiling or hitting the floor. And then all of a sudden, like, year 5, 6 in, he breaks that ceiling. It just, at some point, like, just guys just come down. Like, we think about like
Mhm.
the Jason Day prolonged period from 15 to 16. Eventually, just, it cools off. Spieth or Hovland, like, it's just how golf works. And I just think while Xander, like, he's not going to crater, like, he's not going to
Mhm.
just completely lose it, but I think he's going to more go towards his baseline
Mhm.
of just excellent elite golfer, but the ceiling isn't quite as where it was last year.
And you just look right past Rory at this point, like Northern Ireland. It's
I
just
mean,
not even.
look, he did come back with what, a 65 to make a run towards the cut
Uh-huh.
on Friday after putting, I think, two out of bounds
Which was
in
way
the
too
open.
big of a storyline in the Open Championship film. Like they just
Yes.
they spent way too much time on Rory when I wanted them to spend a little bit more time on how the golf course was playing for everybody else. But
Did
do
they spotlight the 15 that David Duval took on number
you,
7? Because
no, they
I have a betting story for that. They hung a line. I think it was like over under like 84 and a half round score for Duval, and it was bad weather. I slammed the over. I'm like big bet. I'm like, he has no shot. And he actually came out, I think he was one under after four. And I was just like, what the fuck is going on? But then he ends up going to number 7, had himself quite a hole. If you want to see all the gory details, you can look it up. But basically, he played the wrong ball, lost, I think, 3 balls on the hole, and took a 15. And that was enough for him that day to cash that bet easily. So, but yes, I remember distinctly the Rory buzz because he had just won the RBC Canadian Open at Hamilton. Everybody was making that little
yeah.
comp there as well. And just the Northern Ireland guy, and it just the spotlight that was on him that day. It reminded me of in 2015 Chambers Bay with Tiger, how it was just a complete train wreck, but they would not take the cameras off him. And you saw every single gory detail the entire round. That's how it was that day.
So what do you think is the most likely major for Rory to contend at in 2025?
I mean,
You still
it's
have
probably,
you have to say Quail, right?
yeah.
Yeah. But
I
that's
mean, like
rarely how it works out.
I don't see how this would be a bad venue for him. He just has to get all the hoopla out of there.
Yeah, I don't know if this golf course is going to accentuate his driver the way that Quail, not that Quail really accentuates his driver that much, but like, yeah, maybe Oakmont is the the golf course where, based on his skill set, he really has the highest advantage. I mean, in Quail, he's been phenomenal at. So
Okay.
I don't know. You know what's interesting? This is I think that the missed fairway penalty will be lower than Troon. Like I talked so much at Troon about how this being driving accuracy was so supremely important, which led me down the route of Russell Henley, led me down the route of Shane Lowry. Uh, I don't know if it's the best fit in the world for Rory. I think I'd probably prefer him at the others. I was just curious if you felt stronger about him here because you were a little bit lower on him at the other majors. Bit
So
of trivia.
I have some driving accuracy data from this tournament, by the way. If you want me
Okay,
to share that, and
shoot it to me quickly, and then
it
I have one more trivia for you.
it's a mixed bag. So
Yeah,
Lowry, Fleetwood, Westwood, Hatton, Fowler, even Kepka, they drove it pretty well. They hit a lot of fairways. But you also have Finau, who hit barely half of his fairways. You had Big Shot Bob hit 46% of his fairways. You had
yeah,
JT, who finished like, he had a top 50 finish. He hit 41% of the fairways. So, you know, the, I think I think it is unfair to try and compare the missed fairway penalty between Troon and this place, because I think just at Troon, with how that golf course is set up, like it just like that is. I just think it's unfair to try to even put it in this
sure.
class.
Yeah,
So
I hear what you're
yeah,
saying.
but it's a mixed bag. I mean, generally speaking, most of the guys in top 10 hit a lot of fairways,
Yeah,
but it definitely was not like you weren't out of it
yeah.
per
It
se.
seems like we're both banking on middle iron play
Yes.
over either distance or accuracy. Do you know who has the ultimate home game here? I mean, we are talking this guy is from Portrush and started his career as a caddy at Royal Portrush.
Who would that be?
Brooks Koepka's caddy, Ricky
Oh yeah,
Elliott.
I remember that. I remember
Yeah.
I remember that.
And
Yeah.
Brooks talked about, Brooks had a finished ended up finishing fourth, miles behind Lowry, but he had a really good Open that year. And if you remember, that was Brooks at the peak of his powers. He
Mhm.
was the betting favorite. He had won four of the last nine majors. And so Brooks was heading to Northern Ireland to Portrush to try and win his fifth major, to win 50% of the last 10 majors with a caddy who knows Royal Portrush probably better than anyone. I don't know. You get Ricky Elliott, home bed narrative for Ricky Elliott, knows the golf course like the back of his hand. You talk about more of an aerial attack. Brooks remains a phenomenal middle iron player. His open record hasn't been as bad as you would think, and he's does have that fourth in 2019 at Royal Portrush.
Mhm.
Um, Maybe this is like the sneaky Brooks spot.
Well, I mean, if he wasn't paired with the cooler JB Holmes in the
Yeah,
final round, I
there
mean,
you
you could
go.
also tell too, and it was confirmed later on. I'll get to that, but early on the round, he made four straight bogeys. He did not come out of the gates well, but it seemed like he was definitely annoyed by JB Holmes's antics, plumb bobbing everything, taking his sweet time, and it turned out they caught him flipping the bird to JB as he's plumb bobbing from like 5 feet. And I think Brooks starts walking off. So he was clearly unhappy that day. But yeah, like that was when he had won the PGA. He almost ran down Woodland at Pebble. He finished second to Tiger at the Masters. So yeah, that was the ultimate Brooks at his peak of his powers there. It just depends on, I mean, Brooks, you just never know. Like I'm a Brooks guy, and sometimes you think that he's, especially the last couple of years too. Like you think he's kind of peaking in the majors, and he just isn't anymore, or he just ends up showing up. So, now it could be. The problem is just with Live that we'll talk about. When we talk about on this show, it's so hard. It's just hard to know what's
They need to
actually
figure out a
going on.
better lead into the Open strategy for those guys.
Yeah. Well, they're playing that same course I think last time, which is not a good comp for any.
Valderrama, right?
No, it wasn't Valderrama. It was the one that
In London,
in London that was
like
sponsored by like
the Parkland golf course in London.
it's like it was like the English versions of John Deere. Like they own that golf course. And it just was not anything really close to what they were going with. I actually thought the Valderrama course, what it offered, it's a bad golf course, but as far as like a tune up to Troon, it wasn't terrible. But the other one though just was not good.
Yeah.
So that it's just, but it's I don't know. That's a different conversation. We're not going to get into a live conversation here, but
Yeah.
it's
So
it's it's hard to get anything from it.
so I would say I'm just writing down our one pick for each.
Okay.
Um, I would say let's put our own money behind it and see who has the total money earned before our four guys. But we actually may have something next week that we're also going to put our own money behind with a lot more of our friends that may uh, dive into a little bit more 2025 majors talk. I think we'll have a deep, well, I would imagine, I know everyone listened. So I don't think we'll be playing with too much of a leg up, but yeah, we will do a majors now that you have all of the majors info on these golf courses. Next week on the podcast, we will do a majors draft with a bunch of the team members at ISN. So that'll be a really fun episode airing next week on the podcast feed. Anything else, Steve, before we get out of here?
No, I think we have definitely covered it. We managed to go 2 hours again.
Yeah.
But at least this time I feel like with just we don't see Oakmont all that much in some of the changes and just some of the mysteries with the Open, trying to dissect that golf course. I think 2 hours was a little more warranted,
Mhm.
more in the weeds than having 2 hours on golf courses that listen, it was a great conversation. I'm glad we had it. I thought it was
I thought
entertaining, but
I know that I had a little bit more of a speculative nature to me around Portrush.
yeah.
I thought our Oakmont, I thought I was really proud of my research at least, and I know you always bring it as well on Oakmont. So I think that was a really good conversation. And I think if anyone hasn't bet Zalatoris 100 to 1, I would do that right now.
There's no
We
doubt.
have,
Yeah.
yeah, we haven't missed on one of these futures bet yet in terms of at least you're going to get some value on these guys. So, and I feel pretty confident that can't lay is going to go off way lower than 40 to 1 as well.
I
So,
agree.
yeah. All right, Steve, thanks for doing this, my friend, and I will see you next week.
Yep. Thank you.